Disclaimer: this is a work of speculative fiction. All characters, organizations, events, and research described herein are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, institutions, or scientific developments is purely coincidental. Welcome to Human Drift, a series of slow descents through the body, the mind, and the strange edges where time begins to bend. Before we begin, this episode is dedicated to Rebecca. Happy birthday. May the year ahead meet you gently, softer in its edges, clearer in its direction, and kinder in all the places life once felt sharp. Here we move slowly. We breathe differently. We let the nervous system unclench. These journeys aren't stories. They're descents, maps of the inner terrain where physiology, memory, and the strange edges of consciousness blur into one continuous landscape. You don't need belief. You don't need effort. Just presence. Settle. Let the noise loosen its grip. Let the system soften. Let the dark become friendly again. And drift with me into the place where the mind opens and the night does its work. Human Drift, virtual fire hearth near-death experiences, nocturnal exploration. We're going to talk about something humans have been talking about since before we had language for it, since before we built fires like this one, since the first person woke up from the edge of death and tried to explain what they saw. Near-death experiences, not as a story, not as entertainment, not as proof of anything, but as a phenomenon, something that happens to people, changes them, leaves them different, and asks us to think carefully about consciousness, about identity, about what it means to be embodied, and what it might mean to step outside that for a moment. We're not here to convince you of anything. We're here to explore, to sit with the strangeness, to honor the experience without flattening it into certainty. Let's start with the threshold, the breaking point. Most near-death experiences begin with a discontinuity, a sudden, irreversible break in the continuity of lived experience. Car crash, a cardiac arrest, a drowning, a surgical complication, an anaphylactic collapse. One moment you are here in your body, in the world, in time. The next moment you are not. And what happens in that discontinuity is what we're here to understand. The first thing people report across cultures, across centuries, across belief systems is a sense of separation. They describe suddenly being outside their body. Not metaphorically, not as a dream, but as a direct, immediate perception. I am here and my body is there. They see themselves from above. They watch doctors working on their chest. They see the room from a corner of the ceiling. They describe details, the instruments on the tray, the color of a nurse's shoes, the conversation happening outside the door that they could not have perceived from their position on the table. This is called an out-of-body experience, and it's the most common entry point into a near-death experience. Now, there are neurological models for this. The temporoparietal junction, the part of the brain that constructs your sense of spatial embodiment, your sense of where I am in space, can misfire under extreme stress. Oxygen deprivation, sudden drops in blood pressure, surges of neurochemicals. All of these can disrupt the normal integration of sensory input, and the brain can produce a dissociated sense of self. You feel like you're floating, you feel like you're watching yourself. This is a known phenomenon. It happens in fighter pilots experiencing high G-forces. It happens in trauma survivors. It happens in people under anesthesia. The brain under duress can lose track of where you are. But here's where it gets interesting. The people who experience this don't describe it as confusion. They don't describe it as disorientation. They describe it as clarity they've ever seen, as thinking faster, perceiving more, understanding more deeply than they ever have in ordinary waking life. One woman who collapsed from a sudden infection described it this way. I was above my body and I could see everything, not just the room, but through things, as if I had 360-degree vision, as if I was everywhere at once. And I wasn't confused. I was more awake than I've ever been. This is the paradox that sits at the heart of near-death research. If the brain is dying, if oxygen is being cut off, if neural function is collapsing, why do people report enhanced consciousness? Why do they describe the experience as more real, more vivid, more coherent than anything they've experienced before? Let's sit with that for a moment. Let the fire crackle. Let the question breathe. We don't need to answer it yet. We just need to notice it. There's something else worth noticing here. The sense of separation, of being outside the body, is often accompanied by a feeling of immense relief, not terror, not panic, but a sudden lightness, freedom, a sense of being released from something heavy you didn't realize you were carrying. People describe it as taking off a tight coat, as stepping out of a suit of armor, as finally being able to breathe after years of holding their breath. One man who had a cardiac arrest during surgery said this: "The moment I left my body, I felt this overwhelming sense of, oh, I'm not that. I'm not this aging thing on the table. I'm not this collection of aches and fears and memories. I'm something else, something lighter. Something that was there before the body and will be there after." This realization, this sudden experiential understanding that identity is not synonymous with the body, is perhaps the most foundational shift that occurs at the threshold. Because once you've felt it, once you've experienced yourself as something other than the physical form, you can never quite believe in the body's permanence the same way again. You know, in a way that bypasses belief, that you are not reducible to flesh, and this knowing changes everything. But we'll get to that. For now, let's stay at the threshold. Another pattern. Many people, once they've stepped out of their body, report a sensation of movement, not walking, not flying exactly, but a kind of frictionless gliding, a sense of being pulled or drawn towards something. Often they describe a tunnel, a dark space, sometimes with walls, sometimes just darkness, and at the end of it, a light, not a physical light, not a lamp or a sun, but a light that feels alive, that feels aware, that feels like it knows them. The tunnel is one of the most consistent elements across cultures. A Tibetan Buddhist monk who nearly drowned described a long corridor of deep blue-black with a doorway of white radiance at the end. A Japanese businessman who had a heart attack described a passageway, very dark, very quiet, and a brightness ahead that felt like home. A 5-year-old girl who wandered into a lake and lost consciousness described a dark place, like being inside something soft, and then a beautiful lady dressed in bright light. These are not people who read the same books, who grew up in the same traditions, who were primed with the same imagery. And yet the pattern repeats. Why? One psychological model suggests that the tunnel is a visual artifact, the result of the visual cortex shutting down from the edges inward, creating the sensation of moving through a narrowing field of vision toward a central point of light. This is plausible. It's testable. It might even be true, but it doesn't explain why people report the tunnel as a space they are moving through, not just a visual effect. Why they report feeling that they are going somewhere, that something is drawing them forward, that there is intention, purpose, direction, and it doesn't explain why the tunnel, for most people, is not frightening. You would think that being pulled through darkness toward an unknown destination would trigger panic, would activate every survival instinct, would flood the system with terror. But that's not what people report. They report curiosity, they report calm, they report a sense of inevitability. Not in a fatalistic way, but in the way you feel when you're finally heading home after a long journey. One woman, who had a stroke, described it this way: "The tunnel wasn't scary, it felt ancient, like it had been there forever, like it was supposed to be there, like it was the way everyone goes, and I just hadn't known about it yet. And I thought, oh, so this is how it works. That sense of recognition, of suddenly understanding something you didn't know, is common. People describe the near-death experience not as encountering something alien or foreign, but as remembering something deeply familiar, as if they have been here before, as if this space, this state, this mode of being is somehow more native to them than the embodied life they've been living. And then there's the light itself. People struggle to describe it. They say things like, "It was brighter than anything I've ever seen, but it didn't hurt my eyes. It felt like love, like being held, like being known completely. It wasn't just light. It was presence." Some describe it as a figure, a being of light, a presence that communicates without words, that radiates warmth and acceptance. Some describe it as God, as Christ, as a divine entity. Some describe it as formless, as pure consciousness, as a field of awareness that they are merging with. And some describe it as simply everything, as the totality of existence, as the source of all things, as the truth behind the world. What's important to notice here is not which description is correct, because we have no way of verifying that, but that the emotional tone is consistent. The light, however it's described, is experienced as unconditionally loving, non-judgmental, all-knowing. And for many people, this is the first time in their life they have felt completely safe, not physically safe, not safe from harm, but existentially safe. Safe in a way that transcends all the conditions and contingencies of ordinary life, safe in a way that doesn't depend on anything they've done or failed to do, safe in a way that feels like coming home to a place they didn't know existed. One more pattern before we move deeper. Many people report what's called a life review, not a judgment, not a moral reckoning, but a kind of panoramic replay of moments from their life. Not in sequence, but all at once, as if time has collapsed and every experience is present simultaneously. And here's the striking part. They describe experiencing it from multiple perspectives. Not just their own memory of an event, but the felt experience of the other people involved. A man who had a cardiac arrest described reliving a moment when he had been cruel to his daughter, and he felt in that review what she had felt. The hurt, the confusion, the love underneath it. He said, "I wasn't being judged, I was being shown, I was being invited to understand." This, perhaps more than anything else, is what reshapes people. Not the light, not the tunnel, but the sudden, overwhelming sense that how we treat each other matters, that consciousness is relational, that we are not separate, that every interaction leaves a mark in a field of awareness that is larger than any one of us. The life review is often described as happening in the presence of the light, or with the light, as if the light itself is the witness, the holder, the space in which the review unfolds. And what people report is that the light does not judge, it does not condemn, it does not punish, it simply holds the entirety of the life, the beauty and the cruelty, the love and the fear, the moments of grace and the moments of failure, all of it, without flinching, without turning away. And in that holding, people often experience what can only be described as radical forgiveness. Not forgiveness granted by an external authority, but a kind of self-forgiveness that arises naturally when you see your life from a perspective wider than your own ego, from a perspective that includes the complexity, the conditioning, the pain that shaped every choice you made. One woman, who had a near-death experience during childbirth, described it this way: "I saw everything I'd done wrong, all the ways I'd hurt people, all the ways I'd been small and petty and afraid, and I expected to feel shame, to feel crushed by it. But instead I felt compassion for myself, for the scared child inside me who was just trying to survive, and I understood for the first time that I had been doing the best I could with what I knew, with what I'd been given. And so had everyone else. This is the medicine of the life review, not punishment, not guilt, but perspective, a widening of the lens through which you see yourself and everyone else. Sit with that. Let it settle. The fire is still here, you are still safe. We are going to go deeper now. Now we step into the part that is hardest to talk about, because we are stepping into a space that does not obey the rules of ordinary perception, a space where time doesn't move forward, where distance has no meaning, where thought and experience are the same thing. People who have near-death experiences often describe a sense of being everywhere and nowhere, not in a vague, poetic sense, but as a direct, immediate experience of being without location. They say things like, "I could be anywhere just by thinking of it. I was in the room, and I was in the hallway, and I was with my daughter in another city, all at the same time. I didn't have a body, but I could perceive everything, not through eyes, but through knowing." This is not a metaphor. This is how they describe it. And it's consistent across thousands of reports, across cultures, across centuries. In classical Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, this is called vijnana, a kind of knowing that is not mediated by the senses, not constructed by the mind, but directly apprehended. In Western phenomenology, it's sometimes called pure awareness, consciousness without an object, awareness that is aware of itself without needing a thing to be aware of. In the language of near-death researchers, it's called non-local consciousness. The hypothesis that consciousness is not produced by the brain, but mediated by the brain, and that under certain conditions, consciousness can operate independently of neural activity. We don't need to decide what's true here, we just need to notice what people are reporting, and what they're reporting is an experience of being unbound, freed from the constraints of the body, freed from the constraints of time, freed from the constraints of space. Let's look at one example. A woman, born legally blind, never able to see shapes or colors, wandered into a lake as a child and lost consciousness. She was pulled out, resuscitated, and when she woke, she told her family about the beautiful lady dressed in bright light who had been with her. But more than that. She described what she had seen, the leaves on the trees, the feathers on the birds, the eyes of the birds, the grain of the wood on the telephone poles. She said, "I could see better than 20/20th's vision. I could see colors I don't have names for. I could see everything." She had never seen a leaf before. She had never seen a bird. But during her near-death experience, she saw them with a clarity and detail that exceeded ordinary sight. This is documented. This is not an isolated case. In a study of 31 blind or severely visually impaired people who reported near-death experiences, 9 of them, blind from birth, described detailed hyperreal vision during the experience. Not imagination, not dream imagery, but perception that felt more real, more vivid, more accurate than anything they had experienced before. How? If consciousness is produced by the brain, if vision requires a functioning visual cortex, if sight depends on input from the eyes, how can someone who has never had that input, whose brain has never developed the neural pathways for visual processing, suddenly see? We don't have an answer. We have theories. We have models. We have speculation. But we do not have an answer, and maybe that's okay. Maybe part of the gift of sitting with this phenomenon is learning to be comfortable with not knowing, with mystery, with the edge of understanding. There's another layer to this. The blind woman who saw the leaves, she didn't just see them. She described them as more beautiful than anything she had ever imagined. She said the colors were off the spectrum, that they were richer, more luminous, more alive than the colors she had been told about by sighted people. She said, "I didn't know beauty could be like that. I didn't know the world could be like that. This quality of heightened perception, of experiencing reality as more vivid, more saturated, more intensely itself than it appears in ordinary consciousness, is common in near-death experiences." People describe it not as hallucination, not as distortion, but as clarification, as if the veil has been lifted, as if they're seeing things the way they actually are, rather than the way the brain usually filters them. And this raises a question. What if ordinary perception is not an accurate representation of reality, but a constrained version of it, filtered down, dimmed, simplified so that we can function in the narrow bandwidth of physical survival? What if the brain's job is not to reveal reality, but to limit it, to reduce the overwhelming complexity of existence down to something manageable, something we can navigate without being paralyzed by awe? This is not a new idea. Aldous Huxley called the brain a reducing valve, a filter that protects us from being flooded by the totality of experience. Henri Bergson suggested that the brain doesn't produce consciousness but transmits it, like a radio receives a signal that exists independently of the device. And near-death experiences seem to support this model. That when the brain's filtering function is disrupted or released, consciousness doesn't disappear, it expands. Another pattern many people describe encountering presences, beings, entities, consciousnesses during the experience. Sometimes they recognize them as deceased loved ones. Sometimes they describe them as guides, as helpers, as beings of light. Sometimes they describe them as simply other minds, other awarenesses present in the same space. And here's what's striking. The communication is not verbal, it's not spoken. It's described as telepathic, a direct transmission of meaning. A kind of knowing that happens instantaneously, without language, without symbols, without the mediation of words. Is it a hallucination? But if it's a hallucination, it's a remarkably consistent one. And it's one that leaves people profoundly changed, not traumatized, not confused, but transformed, grounded, and often fearless. Let's talk about the boundary. Many people, during the near-death experience, describe encountering a threshold, a line, a barrier, a point of no return. Sometimes it's described as a river, sometimes as a gate, sometimes as a formless knowing if you cross this you cannot come back, and at that threshold people report being given a choice. Sometimes the choice is explicit, a voice, a presence, a knowing that asks, do you want to stay or do you want to return? Sometimes the choice is implicit, a sense that they could keep going, but something pulls them back, something tethers them to the life they left behind. And they came back changed, not always better, not always enlightened, sometimes more confused, sometimes carrying questions that never leave, but changed. Let's walk in. This is the near-Earth astral, the grey layer near Earth. For many experiencers, the first thing they enter after separating from the body isn't light. It's something that feels like a dream made from the ink of memory. A corridor, a house, a street they knew as a child, a version of their bedroom but with the walls breathing, or the colors wrong, or the furniture misremembered. One man described waking in what looked like a hospital hallway, but the lights were too dim, the corners too soft, the air too thick to be air. He said it felt like the world was out of focus, like something was trying to remember how to build reality but didn't quite get it right. Another woman described walking through her grandmother's garden, but every flower she touched turned into a memory. Not images, but feelings, regret, warmth, shame, love, laughter unfolding like petals. A third experiencer found himself standing in his childhood kitchen at 3 a.m. with moonlight coming through windows that had never existed in the real house. He said, the refrigerator was humming, but it sounded like breathing. Everything felt significant, but I couldn't say why. It's not stable. It's not physical. It's not dangerous. It's a soft room where consciousness reorients itself to being out of the body. Think of it as a transition space, a decompression chamber. A place where the mind adjusts up, operating without sensory input, without proprioception, without the anchor of flesh. The environment here is constructed from the experiencer's own psychic material. Memories leak into architecture, emotions become weather, unfinished. Business manifests as doors that won't open or voices calling from rooms you can't quite reach. And this is where the shadows appear, not demons, not monsters, not attackers, shadows of self. Fragments of unresolved emotion, old patterns, old versions of you that were never fully lived, never fully acknowledged, never fully healed. One woman said, I saw a figure at the end of the hallway. It wasn't threatening. It was waiting. It looked like grief I hadn't dealt with yet, like my grandmother's death still sitting in a chair expecting me to finally cry about it. Another man saw shapes that mirrored his posture, tilted heads, hands clasped, as if his own fear had put on a costume and stepped outside of him. He said they didn't speak. They didn't move toward me. They just stood there reflecting something back that I wasn't ready to see. A third experiencer described meeting herself as a child standing at the bottom of a staircase. The child's self was crying but making no sound. She said, "I knew if I walked down those stairs I would have to feel everything I buried. So I turned around, and when I did, the hallway changed. This realm is subtle, symbolic, reflective. Think of it as the psyche trying to catch up with the fact that it has left the body. Some NDE survivors don't mention this realm because it's hard to describe without sounding dreamlike. They worry people will dismiss it as mere imagination or morphine dreams. Others say it was the most important part of the journey, more important than the light, more important than the peace, because this is where they met themselves for the first time. 2. The malleable middle. The thought form world at a certain point, the grey melts, the mind loosens. The environment stops mimicking memory and begins responding to emotion. This is the middle astral, the malleable world. Here you move by intention. There are no steps, there is no distance. You think of a place and you appear there. You recall a person and their presence forms beside you. You feel fear and the world tightens. You feel curiosity and it brightens. You feel longing and you drift towards something familiar that may not exist in physical reality at all. One experiencer said, "I found myself in a field that felt like the memory of grass instead of grass itself. Every time I felt calm, the sky lit up. Every time I felt confused, the ground rippled. It was like the landscape was made from my own nervous system." Another, "It felt like walking through a dream that understood me better than I understood it. I wanted to see my daughter and suddenly I was standing in a version of her room, but she wasn't there. Instead, there was a presence, warm, protective, that felt like her essence without her form." A man who nearly drowned described willing himself toward the surface and watching the water around him turn from dark to gold as his panic shifted to determination. He said, "I wasn't swimming. I was thinking myself upward, and the water knew what I meant. Here, people often meet others. Not always deceased loved ones. Sometimes strangers, sometimes presences that feel like guides, sometimes simply awarenesses that stand near you without form and observe with kindness. There is communication but not speech. Meaning transmits instantly. Understanding flows like water. You don't hear words, you receive concepts whole and complete." One man said it was like thinking and being understood happened in the same breath. "I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't have to translate emotion into language. Everything I felt was already known." A woman described meeting a presence that felt masculine but had no face, no body, just a sense of witnessing. She said, "He didn't say anything, but I knew he was asking, 'What do you want to do?' Not in a judgmental way, in the way a teacher asks when they already know you know the answer. This is also where many people make the choice to return, the choice to continue, or as some phrase it, the choice to dissolve. But not everyone feels this as a decision. Some simply feel a pull, a magnetic draw back toward the body that has nothing to do with volition. Others feel they are being gently guided by something they cannot name. One woman said it was like being a child being carried to bed. Which brings us to the third layer. 3. The higher astral, the soft geometry. Not everyone reaches this place. Some go straight to the light, some only touch the grey, some float in the middle. But thousands describe a realm beyond thought forms that is unmistakably different, calmer, quieter. more neutral. It is not emotional like the near-earth layer. It is not symbolic like the middle realm. It is geometric, soft structures, vast spaces, light with intention but without personality, forms that feel architectural but not built, patterns that feel mathematical but not rigid. Some describe it as crystalline, some as endless hallways made of translucent material, some as a space that feels like being inside a thought that has no thinker. This is not heaven. This is not the presence from Act 2. This is something else. An architecture of consciousness that feels ancient and impersonal and beautifully stable. One man said, it felt like standing inside music that had forgotten how to make sound. Everything was harmonic but silent. I could feel the structure of it pressing against my awareness like wind against skin, but there was no wind and I had no skin. Another described it as a cathedral made of stillness. A woman who coded during surgery said she found herself in a library without books where every surface hummed with information I couldn't read but somehow understood. But what's most striking is this. People report feeling completely safe and completely anonymous at the same time. Identity loosens here. The eye becomes porous. The boundaries of self begin to blur. You feel yourself dissolving gently into something wider, not a being, not a god, not a person, but a field, a unified field, a background hum, a collective awareness that you are part of but not separate from. One experiencer said, I started to forget my name, not in a scary way, in a relieving way, like taking off a coat I had been wearing for decades that I didn't realize was heavy. Another said, I could feel other minds nearby, but not as individuals, more like notes in a chord, all of us vibrating at slightly different frequencies but making the same sound. And this is the place where many experiencers say they were given the option to go no further, not forced, not judged, not commanded, invited. One man described a presence, not the light, not a being, more like a directional pull that said without words, if you step past this point, you cannot return. He didn't cross, he wasn't ready. He said, I felt my daughter's face like a tether pulling me backward, and I let it. Another experiencer, and this is important, said he did cross into something horrific. A hell-like landscape, full of despair, full of isolation, not fire, not punishment, not demons with pitchforks, more like a world built from the darkest emotional material he carried. He said, I was sinking. The ground was soft like wet ash. Everything was grey and cold. I could hear voices, but they weren't speaking to me. They were just repeating things. I'd said things I'd thought the worst parts of myself on loop. Something was pulling me deeper. I could feel it like gravity, but heavier, intentional. But then something else, I don't know what, pulled me back up. He woke on the operating table screaming, but alive. He said later, I don't know if that was hell or if I built it. But it was real. And I've spent 10 years making sure I never go back. These extremes, bliss, horror, neutral stillness, symbolic rooms, dreamlike landscapes, are all part of the same continuum, the same plane, the same layer of reality seen through different emotional lenses. The astral plane isn't one place, it's many places, all built from the same fabric, consciousness untethered. 4. How it ends. The astral plane doesn't end with a door, it ends with a direction, a pull, a drift, a thinning. A shifting gravity that draws you back toward the body or forward into the light or sideways into something we are not here to describe tonight. For some, the transition is instant. One moment they're floating in geometric silence. The next they're gasping in a hospital bed with pain flooding back in like a tsunami. For others, it's gradual. They feel themselves being reeled in slowly, passing back through the layers in reverse. The geometry softens into symbols, the symbols collapse into memory. The memory tightens into bone. One woman said it was like being poured back into a jar. I could feel myself getting smaller and more defined until I was just me again. And it hurt. Another described it as putting on a wet suit that had shrunk in the dryer, But nearly everyone who returned remembers one thing: not dream real, not imagination real, not hallucination real. Real in a way that made physical life feel like the thinner layer, like the astral world was the deeper structure behind the physical one. Like matter was the dream and consciousness was the bedrock, and when they came back, into bone, into breath, into heartbeat, they carried that with them. The knowing that the world behind the world isn't one place but many, the knowing that consciousness moves through landscapes when freed from the body, the knowing that identity is more fluid than we think, the knowing that memory is geography and emotion is architecture and thought is motion. And the knowing that the next chapter, the return, will hurt because the body is small and the astral is vast. Because you've tasted infinity and now you have to fit back into 5 feet and 3 dimensions and a name and a social security number, and the disappointment of discovering that no one believes you. Act 4. The return, the compression, the shock, the aftermath. Coming back is not gentle. For most people, the return to the body is described as sudden, violent jarring, like being slammed back into something too small, too heavy, too confined. One woman described it as being shoved back into a wetsuit that was 3 sizes too small. Another man described it as re-entering gravity after floating in space, the body which they had been free from, which had felt distant, irrelevant, almost forgotten, suddenly reasserts itself with overwhelming force. Pain returns, not gradually, all at once, the chest compressions, the breathing tube, the cold, the noise, the light, the chaos of the emergency room, and underneath all of it, a profound sense of loss. Because wherever they were, whatever they experienced, it felt like home, it felt like peace, it felt like love. And now they are back in a body that hurts, in a world that feels harsh, in a life that suddenly seems small, strange, and unbearably fragile. This is the part that no one talks about, the grief of coming back, the sense of being torn from something vast, something beautiful, something that felt more real than anything here. Many people in the days and weeks after describe a kind of existential vertigo, a feeling that they are not quite fully back, that part of them is still there, that they are straddling 2 worlds and don't know how to reconcile them. Some describe derealization, a sense that the physical world has become less solid, less convincing, less real than the space they were in. They walk through their life as if it's a dream, as if it's a thin overlay on something deeper, something truer. One man who had a cardiac arrest said this: "After I came back, I felt like I was acting in a play. I knew my lines, I knew my role, but I couldn't shake the feeling that none of it was real. That the real world was the one I'd left, and this one was just a stage set, a temporary structure I was moving through until I could go home again." This sense of displacement can last for weeks, months, sometimes years. It's not psychosis, it's not delusion. It's a kind of double vision, a simultaneous awareness of 2 different orders of reality and a profound confusion about which one is primary. And then there's the identity shock, because the person who came back is not the same person who left. They remember their life, they remember their name, their relationships, their history, but they don't feel like the same person, they don't care about the same things, they don't fear the same things, and that creates a profound dissonance, a gap between who they were and who they are now. One man who had a heart attack and experienced a life review said this: "I came back and I looked at my career, my achievements, all the things I'd been so proud of, and I felt nothing. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. What mattered was whether I had been kind, whether I had loved people, whether I had made them feel seen, and I realized I had failed over and over at the only thing that actually mattered." He quit his job. He retrained. He now works in end-of-life care. He said, "The heart attack didn't kill me, it killed the person I was pretending to be." This is the pattern. People come back and they cannot go back to living the way they were living. They cannot pretend that the things they were chasing, status, money, approval, security, are worth chasing anymore. Because they've seen something that recontextualizes everything. They've seen that love is the only thing that survives, that connection is the only thing that matters, that consciousness is not extinguished by death. That there is something more, and that more is not elsewhere, not later, not in heaven, but here underneath the surface of ordinary life, waiting to be recognized. And so they rebuild, not always gracefully, not always easily. Often they lose relationships, marriages end, friendships dissolve. Because the person they were is no longer available, and the people around them don't know how to relate to the person they've become. One woman, who had a near-death experience during childbirth, said this: "My husband kept saying, 'I just want my wife back.' And I kept trying to explain she's not coming back. That person is gone, and I'm not her anymore." And eventually he couldn't accept that and we separated. Not because we stopped loving each other, but because the person he loved didn't exist anymore. This is the hidden cost of a near-death experience. Not the experience itself, but the aftermath. The slow, painful work of integrating something that doesn't fit into the life you were living. And there's another layer. Many people report that after the experience they become sensitive to energy, to emotion, to the unspoken currents that move through every interaction. They describe feeling what other people are feeling, even when those people aren't expressing it. They describe walking into a room and knowing whether it's safe, whether the people in it are in alignment, whether there's conflict simmering beneath the surface. This heightened sensitivity can be overwhelming, because the world, when you're that open to it, is loud. Every conversation carries subtext. Every space holds residue. Every person broadcasts their pain, their fear, their longing, whether they intend to or not. One woman said, "I used to think I was good at reading people, but after the experience it wasn't reading anymore. It was feeling. I could feel their sadness, their anger, their joy as if it was my own, and I had to learn slowly how to hold that without being crushed by it." And then there's the synchronicity. This is one of the strangest, most consistent after effects. People report a sudden increase in meaningful coincidences, events that seem too perfectly timed, too symbolically resonant, to be random. They think of someone and that person calls. They need information and a book falls off a shelf. They ask a question internally and the answer appears in a conversation, in a song, in a dream. The psychological depth and the speculative lens, no hedging, no detours. Ending clean at the edge of Act 4, and they don't just notice these synchronicities, they begin to expect them. Because after you've been to a place where time folds, where thought and reality move together, where intention has force, and meaning isn't separate from experience, it's hard to come back and believe in coincidence. The world starts to feel orchestrated, not controlled, not predetermined, but threaded, stitched with messages, glimpses, nudges, as if some deeper structure is leaking through the cracks. One man described it like this: after the experience, it was like seeing the source code, not clearly, not all at once, but enough to know that reality isn't random, that consciousness interacts with it, that everything responds. This creates a strange psychological tension because on one hand people feel more connected, more attuned, more aligned. On the other hand they feel alien, separated, as if they've become a different species from the people around them. They try to explain what they saw, what they felt, what changed in them. But how do you explain the dissolution of time to someone who's never felt it? How do you describe a consciousness without boundaries to someone still holding tightly to their edges? How do you talk about being loved by the light itself? You don't, not at first. You go quiet. You learn to hold it privately, like a secret, a warmth in the chest, a knowing behind the eyes. A quiet shift in how you move through the world, because you can't unknow it, and then another after effect emerges. A strange calm, a fearlessness, that feels both liberating, because once you've experienced the continuity of consciousness, once you felt yourself as something that doesn't end when the body ends. The fear of death dissolves. It doesn't just lessen, it collapses. People report this again and again. I'm not afraid to die anymore. I know there's nothing to fear. I know where I'm going. This changes how they make decisions. They leave jobs they hate. They leave relationships that suffocate them. They stop pretending. They stop performing for the illusion of control, because the petty anxieties of ordinary life lose their grip when you've glimpsed whatever comes after. But here's the part most people never hear about, the loneliness. Not because they're isolated, not because they withdraw, but because they've seen a different order of reality, and now they have to live in this one. They look at the world and see people rushing, fighting, scrambling for validation, building their lives on fear and scarcity, and they want to shake them gently and say, "It doesn't matter, not the way you think it does. None of this matters the way you've been taught." But they can't. Because everyone has to arrive there in their own time, in their own way. Trying to explain it is like trying to describe color to someone who has only ever seen in grayscale. You can gesture at it, but until they experience it, they can't know it. So the near-death experiencer lives in two realities, the one they return to and the one they can't forget. And reconciling those, bridging those, is the long work of integration. Some people find meaning in service, something that fits who they are now, and for a very small few, the experience opens something, heightened intuition, precognitive dreams, moments of clarity that feel like guidance, not magical, not dramatic, not cinematic, just small, steady glimmers of something beyond the frame. The world feels porous. The mind feels wider. The boundary between inner and outer feels thinner, as if the membrane between worlds never fully resealed. One woman described it like this: "It's like a door opened in me. I don't live on the other side of it, but I can feel the draft. You can hear something in that. A quiet longing, a quiet ache is not just a re-entry into the physical world, it's a re-entry into limitation. Gravity, pain, time, fear, loss, separation, everything the near-death space momentarily lifted, everything it dissolved, everything it held with love. And learning to live again.